it's not to use the word, it's not sustainable long term. And because the other problem that we're having is, of course, we're graduating more and more PhDs and masters to go compete for the same pot of grant funding for scientific research that is not increasing at the same rate. So if you haven't heard, there's this lovely thing called inflation going on right now. If you've been to the stores or the gas pump or to anything like that, you probably know already. But it doesn't just hit. Well, it hits everybody. Inflation is the single biggest tax on everybody, and science actually points it out. But it leads me to a thought on a problem I've observed, a problem that's been on my mind for quite some time. And so I thought this would be a good way, going through this article, to leap off onto that and discuss that. But first, if you missed it, on the 11th, the second episode of the Rogue Journal Club podcast dropped on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify, along with RSS. For your viewing pleasure, or listening pleasure. Now, what's going to happen with that is the other thing I'm going to be doing is this week I will put together the video version of it, and the video version of it will go up on YouTube eventually. But if you prefer to listen on audio, go enjoy yourself and listen on audio. And I know it's more than that. It's being a little weird here. I don't quite know why, but it is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. So go enjoy that, because it's great listening when you're on the road. But have you, the most recent episode was on an article called Political Populism and Public Support for Climate. Well, it wasn't named that, but we named the episode that because that was pretty much what it was looking at. And I think you'll find it fascinating. Not quite, Gina and I thought it wasn't quite as crazy as the last article we did. So, yeah, go enjoy that. Now, on to the main topic of the day. Pandemic lockdown, supply shortages, and inflation wreak havoc with big science projects. New facilities around the world are falling behind their construction schedules, busting their budgets. So, like I said, inflation hits everybody. And of course, we can all, this isn't necessarily about the politics of who's driving inflation or what have you, because there is somebody who's really done a damn good job of it lately, that I think. But that is a whole other topic. Atop Cerro Pachon, a 2,715 meter peak in the Chilean Andes, astronomers are building an extraordinary movie camera. With its 8-meter telescope and giant 3.2 gigapixel camera. Damn. And the Vera C. Rubin Observatory will scan the southern sky once every 3 days, pinpointing billions of galaxies, searching for supernova explosions, and tracking changes in the heavens. In early 2020, workers were on track to complete the $483 million telescope by last month. Quote, we were a freight train moving at full speed, says Victor Krabendam, Rubin's construction project manager. First off, that's a hell of a lot of money. This would be a question of, I love space stuff, so part of me isn't bothered by this, but I also ask the question of, okay, well, who does this benefit? Why is this important to society? Ow. And that kind of thing. Hurt my wrist last week, so pardon me if I'm occasionally grimacing. The Rubin Observatory is only one. Okay, wait a minute. Then the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Travel restrictions slowed construction, as did shortages of supplies such as steel. Now the project remains 2 years from completion, and its cost has climbed about 15%, although the National Science Foundation has yet to set an exact figure. Quote, when the train comes to a complete stop, it's hard to get it going again. The Rubin Observatory is only one of many large science projects around the world that have been pushed behind schedule and over budget by pandemic-related delays, supply chain issues, and now the worst inflation in 40 years. Scientists build a major project using the same process engineers employ to build a bridge, developing a detailed cost and schedule known as a performance baseline that guides every step of construction. That baseline is nearly sacrosanct. Ordinarily, if a project starts to exceed its budget, funders lop off parts of it to contain costs. They increase a project's budget and stretch its schedule, re-baseline it, only as a last resort. That's interesting. I didn't know that about the larger construction projects like this telescope and what have you. But scientific facilities where we do our research are an important part of this, and because they have to deal with construction and what have you, they are very much hit by the same kinds of issues and inflation and what have you that hits everybody else. And so it's not like this doesn't happen all the time here with them. So yeah, inflation does hit the construction of these facilities also. Um, but it raises concerns in other ways for me. But these are not ordinary times. The United States premier builder of big facilities, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, has 13 baselined projects costing more than $100 million and has or is considering rebaselining 6 of them. NSF has 4, including the Rubin Observatory, and intends to rebaseline them all. It's a huge issue and a very complex problem, says William Media, former director of 2 DOE national laboratories. So, you may or may not know this, but there's actually in in the many different agencies that fund science, like Department of Energy, one department under it has the Office of Science as part of the Department of Energy, and they have national labs and what have you. So like Argonne National Lab, for example, is I think under Department of Energy. There's many different national laboratories where huge amounts of research are done, and all of those employees are, typically speaking, federal scientists, federal government paid scientists. That is not true of all of them. An example of this is actually there's a couple of different labs at NASA that NASA has actually where the employees are actually paid by the university that is co-located, and the federal government does not pay them, at least not directly, because a lot of these scientists who are university but housed at this NASA lab compete for federal grant funds and ultimately get paid that way. So there's a little bit of convoluted complexity there, but there's a heck of a lot of these national labs around the country. There's a bucket ton in Colorado. There's a few more in a few other different places. There's a lot of them around, and they do, they have their construction costs, they have their maintenance costs, the whole works in there, and all of that, of course, gets affected by what we're dealing with inflation and supply chains and what have you. The pandemic pushed most projects behind schedule. Physicists at the SLAC National Accelerator Lab are building a 750-meter long superconducting linear accelerator to power a new X-ray laser called the LINAC Coherent Light Source 2. They were just installing the accelerator when COVID-19 struck, and on March 19, 2020, the state of California issued a shelter-in-place order that halted work for 3 months. Officials soon realized they couldn't keep their schedule, says Norbert Holtkamp, SLAC's director for the project. In the United States, long delays invariably drive up costs, Holtkamp says, because funding agencies count labor in the project's costs. Later that summer, DOE extended the project's completion date from June 2020 to January 2024 and increased its cost by 8.7% to $1.136 billion. Most of the increase was contingency to cover further delays. Holtkamp notes, quote, "We didn't know how many COVID waves we would have." Projects thus far along have suffered from the same supply chain issues that have plagued consumers. Physicists at Argonne National Laboratory are rebuilding the Advanced Photon Source, a kilometer-long, ring-shaped particle accelerator used to generate intense X-rays. They had planned to start installing the new $815 million ring this year, but rescheduled it to April 2023 as they struggled to obtain, among other things, the microchips needed to control power supplies, says Stephen Streifer, Deputy Director for Science and Technology at Argonne. Quote, "You'll talk to a vendor about a chip that used to be an off-the-shelf item, and they'll say we'll get it to you in 6 months." Technology is one of the toughest things to get a hold of right now. There's a lot of problems with it, particularly because I think actually a lot of silver is used in tech stuff, and that's really in hot demand right now. I'm kind of going off of a bit of memory here, so if I'm foggy on that, please feel free to fact check me on that one, because I may be wrong just a little bit. But there's a lot of the metals and the rare metals in particular that are used in a lot of tech stuff, like your cell phone, for instance. That those things definitely cause problem, and there is of that. Budgets for grants, even just research grants, let alone these kinds of big building grants like this, count for, salary, benefits, supplies, publications, any workshops they want to run, all those kinds of other things. When people are competing for grants, all those kinds of things get accounted for in these particular have to get accounted for in the budget when you're trying to get a project funded. Be it a big building project like this or even just a simple research grant. So let's see. Climbing cost. U.S. funding agencies have or are considering revising the detailed budget and schedule or baseline for multiple projects already under construction. Yeah. Do remember, of course, these are your taxpayer dollars, and these are the two biggest groups with labs: DOE and National Science Foundation. So yeah, you think about it. There's a $1.14 billion. Well, the rebaselining is done for that, yeah. Oh yeah, they talked about that. Never mind. So let's see. Now inflation is straining projects even further, as for example, the price of steel has doubled over the past 2 years. In principle, a project currently under construction may be shielded from rising prices if contracts with vendors were signed before inflation kicks in. True statement. In practice, however, if small vendors make highly specialized parts if small vendors making highly specialized parts have to eat the cost increases themselves, even bigger supply problems may follow. Quote, there's a risk that companies start going out of business because of inflation. Yeah! Likely thing to happen. Oh, goodness. U.S. researchers often argue that projects in Europe and Asia are insulated from one factor, increased labor costs due to delays, because they typically charge salaries to laboratories rather than to projects. But researchers in Europe counter that when a project needs more money, they face a stiffer challenge getting it. In Lund, Sweden, physicists are building the European Spallation Source, a brand new accelerator-powered neutron source that will be the world's most intense. COVID-19 delays forced leaders to go to the project's 13 member nations to request more money, says Kevin Jones, ESS's technical director, who spent 28 years at DOE's Los Alamos National Laboratory. Quote, having worked in the DOE system, I can tell you that request was a lot harder, he says. In December 2021, the ESS's governing council pushed its completion date back 2 years to December 2027 and raised the cost 20% to 3.3 billion euros. I don't know what that is in dollars, but that's a lot. Oh, goodness. In the United States, NSF ordinarily asks managers of a troubled project to de-scope it or trim its capabilities before the agency rebaselines it, a measure that requires approval from NSF's governing National Science Board. But given the current headwinds, NSF plans to rebaseline all of its projects, says Matthew Hawkins, the head of NSF's Large Facilities Office. Quote, why would we want to take the science capability out of a project as the first step, he says. We would much rather go to the board and ask for more money. In contrast, DOE is sticking with its policy of carefully trimming a project scope before rebaselining. That's because within DOE, a rebaseline project must be reviewed not just by the leaders of the Office of Science, but by a committee of higher-level officials from all parts of the agency, says Stephen Binkley, the office's principal deputy director. Quote, then it gets really, really tight scrutiny, and the case has to be made really carefully, he says. DOE officials expect supply chain issues to remain nettlesome. That's a fun word. Even if the pandemic and inflation wane. Last month, an Office of Science report detailed potential bottlenecks in supplies of everything from materials such as niobium, a superconducting metal, to certain types of software. Projects that have not yet set a budget or schedule may be better able to cope with shortages and inflation, as they can roll rising costs into their baselines. But if any project, baselined or not, becomes too expensive, funders could simply cancel it. It's conceivable that the projects could be dropped. But I think it's fair to say we're not at the point where we have to do that. Okay, so you get the gist. In a lot of ways, the science papers suffer from the same challenge that the science projects suffer from the same challenges that a lot of just you all who might be watching this do. Inflation, supply chain problems, and what have you. However, what makes it different is that for the United States, a lot of the governments in Europe, much of this is funded by the federal government. I was trying to look it up and I couldn't find it, but there is a number from when the March for Science first ran. There was somebody who did a study. Well, I'm trying to find the number and I can't remember the exact number, but most of the scientific research in the United States, and I'm well more than a majority, I think, is funded by federal government grants in one form or another. It is not funded by necessarily private companies as much. It's not necessarily funded by foundations as much, and the donations to foundations. And it's not crowdfunding is very, very, very tiny. Um, a lot of it is funded by the federal government in some form or by state governments. That presents an interesting problem, of course, because then you get into conversations about the national debt, but at the same time, well, in general speaking, we can argue it a couple of different ways, I'm sure. Scientific research is a good thing to fund, but the problem that we're also coming to is aside from things with inflation, aside from things with supply chain, aside from all these issues, I mean, supply chain and inflation stuff hits just general facilities. Like you have a projector that breaks in an office, for instance, or you need a new computer for your student or what have you. If it takes for freaking ever to get the computer, your student may graduate or need to graduate before you actually get the computer they were asking for so they could do their work. Those kinds of things happen. What I get concerned about is the idea that we're spending so much money wise on this that we run into a problem where it's not to use the word, it's not sustainable long term. And because the other problem that we're having is, of course, we're graduating more and more PhDs and masters to go compete for the same pot of grant funding for scientific research that is not increasing at the same rate. And nor should it. I'm not in the camp of saying that the federal government should pay for everything because I do not find the role of the government to be. I do not think the role of the government is to be as large as possible and centralize everything. That I think is a horrible idea, just out of my worldview. But I also think that from this perspective, it's not sustainable long term because you're going to have all of these kinds of pressures aren't necessarily going to go away. You're going to have another problem like this in the future, for inflation, supply chains issues, and what have you. You're also then going to have more people competing for that money that is worth less because of inflation. It makes the scientific enterprise as it currently is, not science, of course. Science, of course, is the process of finding the truth, is a process by which we get at the truth with answers to questions. I'm talking about the disciplines of science. It gets really, really challenging to figure out how the heck you're going to pay for some of these things when you start having a flood of people in different disciplines. And the dollars aren't necessarily there to support it, or the dollars are worth less than they were before, and a lot less than they were before. So when you're thinking about the things with inflation, it is important to keep it in mind because it doesn't just it affects everything. Just as you might be hearing about and different things, it affects everything, and science is a factor in that. But there's also a lot of problems with the fact that we keep going down this way. You're going to have an issue of going to have an issue of spending way too much, way too much in the money department here soon, and it's not ultimately going to be sustainable for science, for the scientific enterprise and disciplines. I mean, here in the U.S., I don't think, because of the combination of more supply of scientists than dollars to pay for them, and dollars becoming worth less is as you have this kind of level of inflation. So hopefully inflation tamps down sometime in the next year. We shall see. Let me know what you think. Comment on the video, share the video, like the video on your way out the door. Subscribe to the channel, please. We'd be glad to have you. Would love to have. Of course, I want to have you. You're awesome people, right? Until next time, I'm Adrienne. I hope you stay curious, my friends.